For today's extra video, we'll be rounding off Pearl Harbor Week by looking at the battleships that survived the attack and their ultimate fate. You can consider this a companion piece to my video last year, the one that looked at the ships still around today. I'll link that one in the description for newer viewers. For now, let's start this off by briefly touching on the ships lost that day. Two of them, Arizona and Utah, remain in the harbor. Arizona is by far the most famous, of course. The footage of her sinking and burning wreck is probably the first image to come to mind from that December morning, and her wreck has become a pilgrimage site ever since the memorial was put in place in 1962. Utah, on the other hand, is far less famous. Her wreck is still in the harbor, but it receives less attention. And on top of that, Utah's smaller memorial was limited to military personnel. That last bit seems to have loosened, with bus tours of Ford Island stopping by the memorial. In any case, that just leaves Oklahoma, the third battleship lost that day, and the only one not still in the harbor. Oklahoma was salvaged in a Herculean effort deserving of its own video. That salvage brought the capsized hulk upright, where the holes were patched and the ship repaired, at least to the point she could be towed off. Unfortunately, that tow ended in failure. Oklahoma's wreck broke her lines and sank in a storm on May 17th of 1947. Her wreck has not been located, and to my knowledge, there aren't any current plans to try. Regardless, that wraps things up with the three battleships, or two battleships and one ex-battleship, that were lost. Now we can move on to the ones that survived, starting with Oklahoma's sister ship, USS Nevada. This battleship was the only one to get underway during the attack. Nevada had the good fortune to both have boilers lit and to be moored alone at the back of Battleship Row. This allowed her to get moving during the attack. That said, it wouldn't save her from damage. Nevada was hit multiple times, and as this damage began to add up, the decision was made to beach the ship. This was done with Nevada's crew fighting fires as the ship grounded near Hospital Point. Nevada took at least 6, but possibly up to 10 bomb hits, and 1 torpedo. Yet the ship was salvageable. Nevada would leave Pearl Harbor in April 1942 for a comprehensive refit and overhaul. She completed this in October of 1942, coming out looking like an entirely new ship. With her new layout, Nevada would spend the rest of the war on shore bombardment duty, from France to Iwo Jima and Okinawa. During this, the ship picked up guns from Arizona. So, through Nevada, Arizona was able to fight back, if you want to look at it that way. Regardless, Nevada survived the war. Old and worn out, she was decommissioned and used in the Operation Crossroads test, painted a bright orange as the primary target, which the bomber crew managed to miss. She would survive the testing with relatively minimal damage before being expended as a target, with her wreck discovered in 2020. I have a video on that I'll link in the description. But not the next ship, USS Pennsylvania. Arizona's far less famous sister ship, Pennsylvania was in dry dock during the attack on Pearl Harbor. She mostly avoided damage as a result. That would not be the case for the destroyers in front of her, USS Cassin and USS Downs, which I've also covered before in an older video. That aside, Pennsylvania was out of the harbor by the start of 1942. She would not return to active duty right away. Instead, Pennsylvania had a large refit of her own that replaced all of her old secondary battery. and further reinforced her anti-aircraft weaponry. As a result, Pennsylvania only returned to combat in early 1943, spending the rest of the war on shore bombardment duty, or if you prefer, hating islands out of existence. Regardless, this would take the ship across the Pacific, including a brief break for the Battle of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944. The battleship only left service when she took a Japanese torpedo to the stern. That was on August 12th of 1945. This damage, along with losing a shaft later on, left Pennsylvania unfit for duty. The ship was, as a result, set to be expended at Operation Crossroads. Except, just like Nevada, Pennsylvania would survive the atomic bombs. She would have to be sunk as a more traditional target on February 10th, 1948. Her wreck has not, to my knowledge, been located. Pennsylvania is also the last of these battleships that is still around. The remaining ones on this list were all scrapped, such as, for example, USS Tennessee. She was moored next to West Virginia and only lightly damaged during the attack. However, she was stuck in place by the sunken battleships around her. Tennessee was only worked free on December 16, 1941, at which point she was towed off for repair work. Repairs that didn't take long, with Tennessee leaving the harbor before the month was over. She arrived at Bremerton on December 29th for more repair work. And then Tennessee was taken in hand for a more significant modernization in 1943. This resulted in a completely new design from the superstructure to the secondary battery. However, just like the other surviving battleships, this was mostly used on blasting Japanese-held islands, aside from joining other Pearl Harbor veterans at Surigao Strait, the last battleship-on-battleship action in history. After that concluded, on October 25, 1944, Tennessee continued her support mission. She would be hit by a kamikaze on April 12, 1945, off of the island of Okinawa. This didn't do enough damage to take her out of the war, with the ship continuing her service right up to the end. Unlike Nevada and Pennsylvania, Tennessee was considered useful enough to be kept in reserve. She would only be scrapped in July 1959. Now for her sister ship, California. This battleship is probably in the middle ground regarding the damage she suffered. California was hit by 2 torpedoes and a couple bombs. This wasn't fatal damage, as the torpedo bulkhead largely held up to the impact. The problem came with progressive flooding caused by open watertight doors and portholes. The crew fought the flooding as best they could, and through counter-flooding, kept California on more or less an even keel. Still, fires aboard the ship eventually forced the crew to abandon the pumps. California would settle on the bottom. Despite that, the ship remained salvageable. California was brought up on March 25th of 1942. Repair work would then get the ship fit for sailing on October 10th, at which point she went in for a full rebuild. This replaced everything above the waterline, aside from the main battery turrets. With that new design in hand, California followed the usual pattern: shore bombardment for the rest of the war, with the notable exception, like other Pearl Harbor veterans, of Surigao Strait. California helped in the destruction of the Japanese Southern Force on October 25, 1944. After this, the rest of her service was fairly quiet, with the exception of a kamikaze strike on January 5, 1945. When the war came to an end, however, California went into reserve. Just like her sister ship, she remained there until 1959, when the battleship was sold for scrap, letting us move to the next ship, USS Maryland. This ship is, along with Tennessee and Pennsylvania, one of the luckier ones that day. When the Japanese attacked on December 7th, Maryland was moored inboard of USS Oklahoma. That protected her from the torpedo bombers, albeit at the cost of Oklahoma being hit by up to 9 torpedoes. Instead, Maryland was only really vulnerable to level bombers and dive bombers, and only 2 of those would land hits, both of which did minimal damage. In fact, Maryland would only lose 4 of her crew during the entire course of the Japanese attack. The only reason she couldn't immediately be repaired was Oklahoma. That capsized battleship kept Maryland wedged in place. She was only pulled free on December 9th, 1941. Emergency repairs had her underway in short order, with the battleship arriving at Bremerton on December 30th. Maryland would be repaired and partially modernized, although not to the same extent as her sister West Virginia. Still, the simpler overhaul had Maryland back in service by June of 1942. She returned to the active combat zone in 1943, where the ship did, well, I think you can guess at this point, bombarding Japanese-held islands. Maryland does have a different story here, however. The ship was hit by a torpedo off Saipan on June 22nd of 1944. This blew a hole in her bow, requiring the ship to sail for repair. When those concluded, after just 34 days, Maryland returned to work. Her only other notable excitement coming in, once again, the Battle of Surigao Strait, as well as kamikaze damage. The first of those hitting on November 29th, 1944, and another aircraft hit on April 7th, 1945. With the end of the war soon after, Maryland was put in reserve, until scrapped with the other Big Five battleships in July of 1959, leaving us with just one ship left to touch on, USS West Virginia. This battleship was easily the worst damaged of the survivors. Moored outboard of Tennessee, West Virginia would be hit by 7 torpedoes and 2 bombs. Only quick action by the crew, particularly Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, kept the ship from capsizing. West Virginia would, instead, settle on a mostly even keel. If you'd like more detail on this subject, I have a video that I'll link in the description. For now, West Virginia was eventually refloated on May 17th of 1942. The ship was pulled into dry dock where the extensive damage could be patched. During this process, a morbid discovery was made. Some of the crew, trapped aboard in the sinking, had survived for several days, before eventually running out of air long before the ship was raised. As for the ship herself, West Virginia left Pearl Harbor on April 30th, 1943. She would be heavily modernized coming out of that rebuild in September 1944, at which point the ship had the same service as the other standards, supporting the troops ashore and engaging the Japanese at Surigao Strait. West Virginia would only suffer minor damage from a single kamikaze on April 1st, 1945, while serving off Okinawa. Otherwise, she survived the war in one piece, being decommissioned in 1947 and scrapped in 1959. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. As you can see, with the exception of Nevada and Pennsylvania, All of the Pearl Harbor survivors were ultimately scrapped. Various pieces survive in museums, such as the ship's bells. But aside from Arizona and Utah, none of these ships can be visited in the modern day. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.